would like to welcome Fred Heutte from the Northwest Energy Coalition. And the Energy Coalition has organizations and utilities and clean energy businesses. Of course, as the name implies, interested in clean energy. And Fred is from the Portland office. And Fred, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks. Good to see you all. A little bit of my background before I start the slides. I'm getting kind of old now. I was a founder of the coalition in 1981. At that point, I was also the executive director of the Oregon Solar Energy Industries Association. Some of you will recognize the scene. I had a telephone and a typewriter and a little office downtown in the Oregon Pioneer Building, which is now the High-Low Hotel. And I've done a lot of things since then. I was on the coalition board for about a decade. I was, for most of the 80s, I was at a company that did energy efficiency program evaluation, really kind of the first independent group doing that in the country, mostly because of the Northwest Power Act and Bonneville setting up its first big energy efficiency effort. We ended up working with utilities and regulators all over the country, actually. In the 90s, I went independent and did some internet, technical work and computer support work. Also began doing some independent data work. So I actually have a background in what I would call data engineering, if you want to call it that. So kind of a branch of software engineering, mostly having to do with back-end database work. But I also stayed involved in the energy field, and going into the 2000s, I switched over much more toward the data side, but still stayed involved in energy, and with particularly with the Sierra Club, which I joined in 2001, and I have been for quite a long time served as the volunteer lead on our international climate efforts. So I've been I haven't gone to the meetings for several years, but very involved in the UN climate process. And then in 2011, I came back to the energy field, from employment with the Northwest Energy Coalition now as a staff member. So that's been nearly 15 years now. And the coalition is based in Seattle. We have members in all 4 Northwest states and in British Columbia. I think I'd like to do more work with British Columbia, but we don't do very much with them. I'm actually presenting to a class at University of British Columbia next month, which will be good. Anyway, a bit more precise. So I'm now getting a message. My internet is unstable. So let me know if it drops out and I'll adjust accordingly. I can switch back to the cafe Wi-Fi if I need to. Anyway, so I'm actually involved quite a bit, not just with Northwest issues, but with the Western interconnection on transmission planning, on market development, on resource adequacy. Those are things we can get into. The coalition is primarily focused on the 4 Northwest states. So we work a lot on those kind of technical issues, also on, especially on power planning, but also on protecting and supporting customers, so especially residential customers in energy use. And our scope is basically the networked energy systems, electric and gas, not fuels. Although they're interested in those things, we don't really get directly involved in that sort of thing. And we're also concerned about the hydro system effects on Columbia River fish and wildlife. This goes back to the Northwest Power Act and the work of the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, which is meeting right now, this very moment, in Idaho to consider those very issues. So you can talk about the council because that's a very important thing for us to work on over the next year. They're doing the new update of a 5-year regional power plan that also includes the fish and wildlife amendment as part of that. And I can talk a bit more about the Power Council because that's something we're very involved in and looking for support and involvement from all of our member orgs, including ahead of your formal inclusion, this group. So that's kind of in a, a bit more of a nutshell, maybe that's what we're doing. And we work closely with our member organizations, and we also obviously work in state regulatory processes at the Oregon Public Utility Commission, in our legislatures, all 4 states, the commissions and the legislatures, a lot with the Bonneville Power Administration, a lot with the Northwest Power Council, and other regional efforts that I can talk about a bit more. I'm on the Western Electricity Coordinating Council's Member Advisory Committee, which is an elected body. There are 5 different sectors: large utilities, small utilities, other industry, state and provincial, and then end users. So I'm on representing the end users, which can be anything from residential to the biggest data centers. That's the range of end users, and lots more. So hope that gives a background. I should say at the outset, I'm not an engineer, even though I would say I have some experience in software engineering, which is not like the sort of thing where you can get, it's not like being a professional engineer where you have you can get a degree and get certification. Software engineering is a little bit more squishy than that, but I think it's a real thing. So at least I think, and I also have a little bit of background. I used to be very involved in ham radio, as a member of the Portland Amateur Radio Club. So I have a basic understanding about electric engineering kind of stuff. But I'm definitely not an engineer per se. So all that said, let me go ahead and share my slides here. And go ahead and, oop, that's not the right one. Hold on. Let's try that again. This takes a moment, I guess. All right, I hope you can see that okay. If you want to ask questions or make comments at any time, that's fine. I'll try to keep this 20 minutes or so, and then we can do Q&A. So I'll be skipping through a lot of this, and Mike will make these slides available to everybody. So this is actually, I didn't really have time to prepare slides for this meeting per se, but I thought, this thing I did 8 years ago might be a good way to kind of organize the talk. This is the talk I gave at the Northwest Power Pool, which is now called the Western Power Pool. They have an annual engineers forum, and for whatever reason, they decided to invite me to speak on my perspective. So I went out to Butte, quite an interesting trip actually, and gave this talk 8 years ago. So let's go to, hold on a sec, sorry. Let's see, I think that should work. Here's our description, a bit of more of the background. I'll note here that, as I mentioned, our executive director is now Tamara Kennedy, who just came on board. Nancy is still around. She hadn't retired, but she's doing other work now. And our board chair listed here, Ben Otto, is now on our staff. And our board chair, sorry, I'm getting some background sounds here. So our, well, I'll just go on here. And here's a description of our basic approach. I can talk more about that if you wish. And I've began talking about, remember I was talking to basically utility engineers who are doing their work every day and don't really have a whole lot of interaction with at the policy level. So I thought I'd start by describing advocacy organizations like the Northwest Energy Coalition, and kind of the range of groups that we have. There's all different kinds. The coalition is interesting in that we have a very broad base. Some groups are just membership, like ESF, you have a membership. We have a membership both of organizations and of people. You can join NWEC as an individual member, but our main focus is on the organizational members. And in turn, there are many kinds that we have, ranging from, we have, for example, Portland General Electric's a member, but also we have some government agencies, Multnomah County Office of Sustainability, City of Portland is also a member. We have local organizations representing communities. We have environmental groups. We have clean energy development. firms and organizations, and there's a really wide range. So what I really wanted to describe to a group of engineers was that you might read in the media about one particular kind of advocacy organization, but there's actually a whole ecosystem of them, and they don't always agree on everything. And our job at the coalition is to help convene a lot of those groups and also to state our own viewpoint, going into the issues that we're dealing with especially in the power system. We're actually active a bit on gas issues. So for example, Northwest Natural, other regional utilities, but we focus mostly on the electric power side. I talked a bit about, how things happen going forward. We have the existing system, plus the addition of technology, policy, and markets. We look at the future needs, the current and future needs of our let's say, mostly focusing on the electric power system. What are the needs? What are the gaps? Filling those needs is particularly, it was an issue 8 years ago. That issue now, under the kind of name of resource adequacy, is front and center now because we've had a lot of changes in the last 8 years, and a lot of, especially on large new loads, data centers and chip fabs and other kinds of big industrial scale loads, things have shifted dramatically in the last couple of years. But I also have to know, at least in the Portland area, this is nothing new. The first data center in Portland came online in 1994 at the Pittock block down at 9th and Washington. Most people don't realize it was an office building for a century. Probably 80% of that building is a data center, and it has been for 30 years. Way back when, in the 1990s, when I toured it, first time I toured it, it was the largest data center in the country outside of Northern Virginia. And now it's not so big. It's about a 30 megawatt load now, and most of the big loads are out in Hillsborough and on the east side. But we are not new to the large, high-tech load. And of course, Intel and others out on the west side have always been large and gotten a lot larger. But 8 years ago, we didn't foresee the dramatic upsurge of interest in these new large data centers and other kinds of loads. The planning for this, especially with respect to the power system, is very complex, multi-layered, lots of different places where this happens, state regulation, utility groups among themselves. For example, the Electric Power Research Institute, regional organizations like the Public Power Council, many, many, many groups. We have lots of not just utilities, but third-party suppliers, state, legislators, governors. Everybody is involved. All of these different kind of players are involved in running the most complex and most essential machine we've got, which is the electric power system. A big focus for the for Northwest Energy Coalition from the very beginning in 1981, following the precepts of the Northwest Power Act of 1980, is our highest priority is energy efficiency. In this region, I can go back into the history if there's interest. At the beginning, energy, and I was around at the beginning, the energy efficiency there was a little bit going on. Utilities had some programs. PG and Pacific Power both had weatherization programs in 1981, but there wasn't a real appreciation for the magnitude of the energy efficiency resource in the Northwest. And back in the 80s, our first job was to convince everybody that energy efficiency, even though it's not a generation supply resource, is very much a resource in terms of its function within the power system. Today, and I won't go through all this, today, the Northwest has developed over 8,000 megawatts of energy efficiency in the last 4 decades, most of it in the last 20 or 25 years. 8,000 megawatts is a lot in a system with a peak demand of about 32,000 megawatts and average demand around 20,000. Now, not all 8,000 of it is operative at every hour of the day. Some things matter more for example, HVAC, air conditioning, heating and cooling, are energy efficiency is more effective there during times when those are operating. But overall, 8,000 megawatts makes this energy efficiency is the second largest resource in the Northwest behind hydro. Another thing we've worked on is the effort to develop renewable energy, solar, wind. I think we'll see a lot of geothermal going forward, other forms that are considered renewable, in addition to the existing hydro. And a new hydro is definitely renewable, but there's really not that much of it we can develop in the Northwest. And a lot of things have been, we have efforts to develop wave energy, for example. It's definitely renewable. But I think solar, wind, and soon geothermal will be the big pieces. Even in 2017, we didn't have very much solar yet in the Northwest. We had a fair bit of wind. We've seen a lot more of both of those coming down. And of course, nationally, where the Northwest 20 years ago was kind of a leader or even a pioneer, especially on wind, now there are plenty of places that have a lot more than we do. So you can see how things have changed. But the trajectory for that renewable development was amplified by the renewable portfolio standard. Oregon passed ours in 2007, so that's almost 20 years ago, and Washington passed theirs on the ballot in 2006. And many places have either a state policy for renewables, or they have utilities that have their own policies as well. So for example, Idaho does not have an RPS, but Idaho Power has a clean energy target with a big portion of that for renewables. So where do we go from here? The same things as I would have said 8 years ago. We still need to do a lot of energy efficiency, flexible demand, traditionally called demand response, but it's more expansive than that. We are, as I said 8 years ago, we needed to get some experience and some scale for renewables. We've done a lot on that. There's a lot more we can do. And the advanced, what I called here advanced RPS, we've done that, and we've gone beyond that in Oregon, Washington, and in California to a much more expansive clean energy policies. So for example, in 2021, Oregon's legislature passed House Bill 2021, which sets clean energy targets starting in 2030 and going out, and targets for decarbonizing the power system. And Washington has similar policies. And then climate change, that's a whole big topic I can talk about. Washington has the Climate Commitment Act, which is basically cap and invest or cap and trade. They're joining with California in doing that. Oregon got to the point of almost adopting that and pulled back because of some political backlash. We've taken a slightly different approach here. We might eventually get to a cap and invest system. I'll skip a lot of this because stuff you probably know mostly, and I have my opinions on, but you're the actual engineers. But a power system has a lot of important attributes that I don't think are really fully understood by people, even people who are heavily involved in the policy part of it. And the way I would summarize this is by saying we have to find the right balance between physics and economics. And the physics part is not well understood. Power engineers sure do. I sometimes wonder how much the utilities that they work for understand that, but we can talk more about that. There are 4 major sectors of the power system. If you think of this way, kind of lay them side by side: supply side, generation, transmission for bulk power, just transfer, the local distribution system. Usually there's a pretty bright line between them based on voltage. And then finally, consumption. The consumption is customers. It's us. It's our houses, businesses, everything that we, everywhere you can plug something in. And the customers don't just take power. We also have a role going forward in providing services back to the grid. That's a big theme for us. I'll skip the history part of it, except to say, as I said, the very last thing here, the future is up to us. And we're at a really interesting moment because the data centers and large loads are really forcing the question on what kind of power grid do we want in the future, and how do we get there, including with all the crosswinds by this really dramatic turnaround in federal policy, which isn't helping us at all. We're going to have to live with it for a while yet. What can we do for ourselves? You know, Oregon's motto is, translated into English, she flies with her own wings. Well, you know, that's kind of where we're at now, because the federal government is not going to help us. And here is my takeaway on kind of the basics of where we need to go. We need a more reliable, cleaner, and more affordable power sector. And I would also add now, with equity, meaning fairness for everybody, not just that everybody has a fair chance to pay their bills, because everybody is better off if everybody can afford to pay their bills, but fairness in how we provide services back to the grid, whether it's how you do electric vehicle charging, or some kind of demand response program, or rooftop solar, or community solar, or whatever it is, to make sure that customers can add something to the grid and get compensated for it fairly. So some of you might remember back in the day, there was a local print shop called Pronto Print downtown in Portland, down at Second and Stark, Third and Stark rather, where my office used to be. And they had this calendar up on the wall with a picture of Jonathan Richmond. Some of you remember him. And it had this little cartoon balloon, which I kind of recreated here. You know, it's the classic three bottling problem. Do you want it fast, cheap, and good? Pick two and call me back. So if we want reliable, clean, and affordable, do we have to pick two? Or can we figure out how to do all three? That's, I think, the big challenge we've got. So I, again, won't read all these. I'll just say more reliable, especially with a grid that has a lot more diversity on it, a lot more inverter-based resources like solar, wind, and batteries. I should say power electronics resources, because that's the real interconnection. A more diverse grid can be a more reliable grid, and really needs to be. And I can get more into the details on the inverter-based resources, because we've learned a lot about that issue since 2017. A cleaner system, less pollution, also not just pollution, but treating our lands, habitat, and climate properly, to conserve them, and to look at not just what happens at the point of production, like a coal power plant, but the entire life cycle. Every resource has environmental consequences. Even insulation for buildings for energy efficiency, that has an impact. Solar requires assembling a lot of different kinds of inputs, that has an impact as well. So all of them have impacts. Which ones can we live with, or what impacts can we diminish, is really important. And finally, affordable. Certainly, Oregon Citizens Utility Board, Oregon CUB, I was on their board for a long time, but lots of other groups and the Northwest Energy Coalition are really concerned about affordability. And then remember, this is 2017. Look at where we are now, with a lot of big rate increases, a lot of impacts on a very large portion of our state has people who cannot afford their bills. That proportion has grown and grown, and it raises lots of really important issues, including how people who have barely been able to pay their bills are helping support the programs that we want for clean energy and for reliability. Are they able to take advantage of those as well? So I'll skip ahead, because I really don't want to go too much longer here. So I talk about my favorite three pieces: TPM, technology, policy, and markets. That's where we're really considered. Look at what's happened in technology innovation in the electric sector in the last 20 years. We've got power sources and storage resources that were either in early development or really not available 20 years ago, and look at where we are now. Creating a much more, moving from an electromechanical grid to a much more power electronic, or just electronics-based grid, moving from things where it really did depend on a lot of mechanical equipment, and moving, especially controls, moving that into an electronic and interactive context, just to name that one, not to mention all the advances in solar, wind, batteries, and all the different technologies, nuclear, et cetera. We, on the policy side, a huge amount of things to say about this compared to where we were 10 or 20 years ago. A lot more attention to the impacts of our policy, and that feeds back into more policy. So we've seen a rapidly expanding amount of policy and a lot of regulation that comes out of that. For example, the Oregon legislature this year passed several important bills. One of them creates, I'll just mention one, called the Power Act, POWER, it's just an acronym. What it really does is sets up a new rate class for new data centers. And this is, we've, for decades, maybe for a century or more, we've had three main rate classes: residential, commercial, industrial. Now we're adding a fourth one, data centers, because they're so large and their impacts, their benefits, and their possible risks are so large. It really requires kind of a separate assessment so that we get the benefits and that other customers don't end up subsidizing, paying their costs when they shouldn't. Data centers can afford to be good citizens on the grid. So that kind of policy is really emerging from the interplay of all these other factors. And finally, markets. And I, again, will not go into this in depth. Power markets have emerged in the last 30 years in the US. It's very complicated. It's far more complicated than it should be. We have lots of different kinds of power markets. We have, well, I would say in most of the West, we have two competing markets now for day-ahead service, not for real time. The real time markets are, most everybody is already in the Western Energy Imbalance Market. There are now two competing markets in the Northwest. We could not have predicted this in 2017. It's very unfortunate because we need to stay with a single market we've got. So there's a lot to say about what's happening with markets. And I said quite a few things at my meeting in 2017 about, what engineering looks like to me, a non-engineer, evidence, rules, and trade-offs. That's the way I would summarize it. And then I talked about, from my perspective as somebody who's been a software developer or engineer, how do we change things? Do you do it sequence, step at a time? Do you do it through an iterative kind of project lifecycle, or do you do it with more of a systemic guidance approach, adaptive management? I think kind of all three. So just to say from a very high level perspective, that the process of developing our power system has got a lot of complicated things going on, but in some point, can we simplify it to say, are we heading in the right direction? I'll skip all of these and just say there's a lot more to talk about. Same here. And then getting to the end here, I'd say, what's, from an engineering perspective, I hear this phrase from my transmission planning friends all the time. What's our desired state? We want a more reliable and affordable Western grid. And we're moving toward, as I said here, intentionally coordinated and co-optimized planning and operations. That's really important because the co-optimization across a very complex, very large Western grid, where any single utility, even the biggest ones like Pacific Gas and Electric in California, huge utility, it's only a relatively small part of the Western interconnection. It's really important because we have a synchronized Western interconnection that we see coordination across all of it. And there's lots of complexity to it. We've made a lot of progress, and there have also been some setbacks, I'd have to say, in the last decade. And, kind of that's where we are right now. Overlay on top of that, the massive demand for new energy services from data centers, chip fabs, et cetera, and retirement of old facilities like some of the old coal plants, other things, the changing climate, which is changing our weather patterns, the demand surge that we've seen as a result of that. And you recall the heat dome in June of 21 or the deep freeze of January 24. Those things aren't, quote, caused by climate change. They're amplified by it. And we're seeing that happening more and more. So here we are. We have an essential service. We have a very complex environment to operate in. So I think of it as being, you can either see it as being a crushing burden or a really big opportunity. And most days I see it both ways. So that's the end of it, and happy to stop and let's have a chat.
Well, thank you, Fred. I see, Ed, you had a couple questions, comments.
Yeah, I see
Yeah.
Ed's, now I see Ed's comments. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, when you were talking about data centers, one of the things that I think has come up a lot over the Hillsborough area stuff has been whether, in fact, they were getting discounts that housers, housing people weren't getting. Is that true?
I would say it hasn't, I think that it's arguable that there has been a subsidy, a cross subsidy, in that the large new transmission and distribution work that PG has done to serve Hillsborough, and this goes back before the data centers became, it goes all the way back to Tektronix, the Silicon Forest idea and all of that. To what degree do those new large facilities get upgrades from this in system upgrades that other customers are paying for that they would not have to pay for otherwise? Okay, there is some of that, but those facilities provide a lot of value. So for example, Intel, a huge economic engine for a region, a lot of employment has led to a rapid expansion. I mean, I remember when a lot of that stuff out there was farms. Just reading the Van der Zandens have finally given up their last foothold out there. People that I knew back in the 80s who'd been there for many decades. And we've seen this kind of very rapid transformation. There are pluses and minuses to that, but I think on the whole, it's been a positive thing. So how do you sort that out? So what I'm saying is I don't think there was any intentional cross-subsidization and anything more than we've had in the previous eras of, moving from a more natural resource-based economy to where industrial to now more of a service-based economy, which still has a lot of manufacturing, especially with Intel and all those kinds of companies. So I just think there's probably been some, but what we have seen in the last 3 or 4 years, especially in the East, not in the West, is a move toward kind of what I would call sweetheart deals between these big new data centers and some of the utilities in the East. There's a report from Harvard University that really goes through in detail, goes through how that has happened. We haven't really seen that out here, but we're concerned about the scale of these new facilities being so large that they might involve, in effect, subsidies by us as ratepayers, by other companies, by other organizations that pay bills. So that was the impetus for doing the Power Act that I mentioned. So I think that that the issue here is scale. If you have a new shopping mall, a big new office building, a medium-sized industrial facility, in the 5 to 50 megawatt range, those are big, but we have processes that know how to evaluate those and make sure they're paying their fair share. When you're talking about something that's above 50 megawatts to 500 megawatts or above, and some of the new data center proposals are at that level, even in this region, and some elsewhere, of over 1,000 megawatts. Remembering 1,000, Portland PGE's average load is about 2,400 megawatts. Peak load is about 4,500. These are really big. They're bigger. That's bigger. 500 watts is bigger than 500 megawatts is bigger than Salem. Bigger than a lot of things. That is a really different kind of thing, and those many of those companies are really big. Now, some of them are kind of new, whatever we don't really know about them. But a lot of the development in our area in Oregon and Washington has been that companies that we know: Microsoft, Google, Apple, Facebook, Meta. Who am I leaving out? Amazon, and they had moderate sized facilities. Now they're proposing mega sized facilities. Even though we know them well and we want to work with them, how do we avoid a situation where the regular customers are overly subsidizing them? So I go into this in some depth because this is a really hot topic right now around the country. And I would say on the whole, we have a way to go yet before the data centers really do pay their full fair share. So we're going to test that out here in Oregon with the Power Act. The Oregon Public Utility Commission is just starting to create rules for that, and it'll take a couple of years to happen. But I think Oregon is out ahead of this issue actually compared to most parts of the country. California legislature passed a bill that didn't quite go as far. The California PUC studied this issue, but the original version of the bill had, create a separate rate class. They haven't done that yet. And if I can skip to Doug's question, because it's related to this, then I'll come back to the interconnection issue. The data centers, like industrial loads generally, tend to pay lower cost per amount of power because there are a couple reasons. There are actually good reasons for that. One is they provide better load factor for the system. They tend to really big industrial facilities, and the data centers operate at a more consistent level across the day, which is better for power management because you're not having to do quite as much to meet peak needs, turning things off and on and so forth. There are a lot of reasons for that. So the second is, just broadly speaking, the cost to serve is a little less because you have one or a few points of billing to manage. You have, the high willingness to pay. You don't have to chase after the really large industries to pay their bills, or maybe you do, but it's going to get paid. There are a number of reasons why that's the case. But in addition, it's true that especially more in the past than now, the big industries were politically powerful and put a lot of pressure on the commissions to lower their costs. And they brought in
Oops.
Right?
You dropped out.
So much for that Wi-Fi. Oh, come on back.
He was just getting to the good part.
Oops.
Okay. I knew that was good. Sorry about that. I knew it was going to happen. So I'm back on my phone again, and we'll see if it works better. Sorry about that. So anyway, unfortunately, I think I lost the chat when I dropped off. Oh no, there we are. So I probably should stop there and just say,
Oops.
but I will say demand charges, a lot of factors go into that. Peak for the commercial and industrial classes, demand charges are calculated separately. For residential, they're typically not, although some utilities want that. You get a monthly charge that folds in a lot of stuff, but you don't have, as a residential customer, you don't have a demand charge. For commercial and industrial, a demand charge is very important because it sends a price signal about what's costly to the system, and industries adjust for that with how they do their operations. It's kind of built in. So hope that answers the question on demand charges. Let me go back and answer the question about synchronized interconnections. To say we are in a synchronized interconnection means there's a whole area that has the same frequency, that's on the same phase. And we have 3 interconnections in North America, actually 4 now that I think about it. Quebec is a separate one, but the East, the West, and Texas in the US are all, and actually the East and West also include parts of Canada. The Western interconnection includes all the Western states from Colorado west. It includes a little bit of Baja, Mexico, right below San Diego, and it includes British Columbia and Alberta. And the frequency and the system stability have to be managed across the entire interconnection. So that's what it means to say synchronized, means we're synchronized in that sense. So especially on frequency. So I hope, and that's really I guess, is it AC or DC? I would say it's an AC concept. The DC just, what people sometimes call a copper plate, doesn't have the characteristics of an AC interconnection with phase and all the other issues, and also with constraints that impede the flow of power because of transmission constraints. So it's an AC concept. Again, I'm not the engineer here. So Ed asked about load variability improvement. Yes, this is a big topic for us. The general concept is known as demand response, or we would rather these days say flexible load. So for example, Portland General Electric has a flexible load plan. They have lots of demand response programs, but they have an overall plan. And the idea is, and they have a virtual power plant concept. The idea is to take all that customer side flexibility, so demand response, how you charge your electric vehicle, manage HVAC system, a water heater, the EV charging. Those are all parts of the customer side. And they also include battery storage on the grid side in their virtual power plant. So they really have the most advanced work on this, really, I think, in the country, actually. The reason that this is important is not just for day-to-day operations, which is where it's helpful, but when it gets really hot, really cold, and demand is really high, reducing that demand has implications, has very positive implications for grid reliability. If we're really close to the edge, don't have quite enough resources, and rotating outages have to start, the demand response load flexibility can push us down from that point. And by the way, this also really needs to include data center flexibility to the extent they can offer that. That's a hot topic right now. But the other thing that reducing peak demand a bit does is it dramatically reduces exposure to power market scarcity pricing. When things are really tight, all kinds of market forces are happening that drive the power costs, the overnight or within the day power costs from an average of, say, $50 to $100 a megawatt hour to 10 times or 20 times that much. And that shows up later in our bills. So load flexibility is load management is it's always been important. It's going to be a lot more important going forward. And that, by the way, and you mentioned batteries. Yes, definitely. So batteries are part of a larger strategy for managing demand. And that includes the battery of your car if you're charging it.
I haven't known about an ability to use the batteries in the car for backfeed.
Yeah, complicated story. There's multiple ways to look at that. One is you just manage the time it gets charged and stay out of the times when demand is really high. So typically demand is highest year round. It's high in the evening from, say, 5 to 9 p.m. And then in the winter, it's high also in the morning from 6 to 9 a.m., something like that. The demand tends to be higher, somewhat lower. Morning demand is up, but not quite as high as in the summertime. This time of year is when we really start to see morning demand showing up. So if you can move your EV charging out of that window, that helps the system because you can charge it earlier, overnight or when you're not driving, and it doesn't matter. What do you care as long as the car can get the full charge? So managing the timing of that charge is an important thing that we can do. That's the first stage. The second stage is taking power out of the battery in the car and either putting it in your house or putting it on the grid, which is also a possibility. This is especially true for fleets. So buses, like school buses in particular, school buses are out in the morning and again in the afternoon, but they can be charged at other times and they can also feed power potentially back into the grid. Fleets, UPS trucks, all that kind of stuff. There are lots of potential there for using a vehicle back to the grid, V2G kinds of thing. But it's really complicated to do, and the economics are tough. At the same time, especially for fleets, I think we'll see more of that in the future. This is a really deeply complicated topic, and it's hard to get there, but it's a real thing.
My understanding is Europe has gotten into that a lot faster than we have.
Yeah, they're doing some things faster than we are, and we're doing some things faster than they are. What we're doing faster than them is dealing with power electronics on the grid, the inverter-based resources. You may have seen the Iberian blackout a few months ago in Spain and Portugal. If you're at all interested, there's some really good engineering work that's been done on that. Meeting here a couple weeks ago in Portland Hilton, we had a big presentation on that. Europe is behind us on managing the performance of solar, wind, and batteries. It's not the solar, wind, and batteries themselves. It's the interface. It's the power electronics between the resource and the grid that needs to be, typically they have all the functions, but they need to be configured properly to ride through grid disturbances. So that's an area where we're ahead. I would say on the vehicle, electric vehicle management side, they're ahead.
Did that presentation you're talking about get recorded?
Yeah, the slides are available. I can put the link in the chat here in a moment. But there was no recording done for that session. It was on Zoom, but it wasn't being recorded, as far as I know.
Yeah. But anyway, thank you. If you can then send us the slides.
Sure.
Yeah, Fred, this is Doug. You mentioned a bunch about the battery backup, residential and fleets and whatnot. One of my concerns has always been, I don't think that the building codes have really caught up with this particular aspect of it. We've all seen the issues where lithium-ion battery packs wind up bursting into flames. I've even seen cases where at bulk charging stations, buses and whatnot, one of them goes up and they're parked so close together that it takes out 4 or 5 buses. I've seen a picture of that. It's one thing if you've got, a single battery in a car or 2 or 3 of them that size, but once you get into double-digit kilowatt hours, such as, a typical home storage facility, you're getting into kind of a battery storage situation, and there's limitations on fire suppression, and the risks of structures going up in flames and a lot of property damage. If you go back to the building codes for battery storage rooms, there's a lot of code requirements around that, but none of that is really built into protecting residential structures, or apartment complexes, or probably a lot of the other stuff. Spacing between charging stations and things like that, I don't think, it's really adequate right now in order to protect that. Do you know of where that situation stands code-wise?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this, but I've read a fair bit, and I'm sure you can find quite a lot, do an internet search. There's especially the big batteries, like the big battery fire down in California, for example,
Yeah.
not the first.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work being done at that level for those really big grid connected batteries. For residential, I don't know the details. It doesn't surprise me that, the codes are behind the curve here. We don't want to overprotect, but we definitely don't want to underprotect.
Mm-hmm.
That's my view of it. And you can do overprotection. I'll tell a little story from 1981 when I was the director of the Oregon Solar Energy Industries Association. Somebody went to the Portland codes office and said, back then, most of the solar we had was solar water heat. There was one guy selling solar PV back then.
Mm-hmm.
But the solar water heat, you have typically for pump operation, you had a plug-in control,
Mhm.
just a clock thermostat. Well, somebody went to the city and said, we don't think that's safe. You should hardwire those things. I mean, a 5-watt demand,
Yeah.
you plug
Yeah.
something into the wall for a
Yeah.
clock thermostat. So fortunately, they didn't end up doing that, but that's what I would say is overprotection. Underprotection is if you have, things in your house that, this gets really back to very fundamental life, health, safety issues. you don't want your storage battery to burn your house down,
Right.
you know, and maybe even cause a problem for the grid. So I know that there are some provisions, but I wouldn't be surprised that they're not adequate. This is something that the solar industry and the storage industry are going to be very involved in, but I can't tell you much more than that.
Yeah, we've got several of these that have got large solar arrays on in the subdivision that I'm in. You know, one of them is like 14 kilowatts on the roof. They've got a 70 kilowatt hour battery bank in the garage, and it's like, really, you know, and what happens if that goes up?
And we know the stories. We know, you can't take your lithium ion batteries, with
Right.
you on the airplane, that, separate and that sort of thing. There are, but it's I think it's a kind of an issue where you got rare but dangerous situations, but they're rare.
Yeah.
What do you do about that? Where do you draw the line? And, California in particular has something over 15,000 megawatts of residential solar and
Mhm,
some commercial, mostly residential,
mhm.
lots and lots of rooftops. A lot more systems now are being installed with batteries as well. I'm not hearing of any major problems. And I keep an eye on things there, and I have friends that work in the industry.
Okay.
So I would say, if you talk to my utility friends and who actually do the work on the ground, they'll say, sure, reliable, clean, and affordable. Safety is first. And I really
Mhm.
agree with that.
Mhm. I mean, it could be mitigated by requiring them to be installed outside, for example, you know, with some fire resistant material a certain distance around them.
Right. And increasingly, now we have lithium ion, but now we have lithium phosphate, other forms that are less risky.
Mhm,
And for example, the California fire happened that they don't do this anymore. They took an old gas turbine hall and turned it into a battery, a battery
mhm.
building. The batteries were close together. And now when you look at the new form, which almost everybody's doing, you have separate containers outside on pads, not near vegetation.
Right.
That seems to work a lot better.
Mhm.
And that's true, by the way. PGE a year ago had 20 megawatts of batteries. Most of it was down in Salem. Now they have 500. There's 200 megawatts out by Troutdale, 200 at Harberton on the Port of Portland land, and then I think 75 out in Tigard. And
Mhm.
they have 400 more, 600 more coming soon. Those things, if all works out well, we'll never hear about them. They'll be fine.
Right. Thank
Fred,
you.
it's pushing 1 o'clock, and I know you have a really busy schedule. Does anybody have a question they just really have to
Yeah,
ask?
I don't have to leave right at 1, so
Oh,
happy to
okay,
keep going for a little bit.
okay, all right. Well, one question I had, Fred, is these data centers, and I've heard a lot of data centers would like to have some nuclear power right at their site and solve their problem. I don't think that's going to happen to Oregon. What are you hearing about that?
No, there are plenty of things to say about nuclear, but I think that there's a lot of hype. But the engineering is real. We have a big company here in Oregon called NewScale, you may know about. They have good engineers that come out of the basically it's a spinoff of OSU nuclear, the nuclear department there. But can they get it built? The first project that they had was too expensive for the small utilities in Utah and so on that were going to be building it, paying for it. The cost is really high. And the second issue is the fuel for most of the new reactor designs is what's called HALEU, high assay low enrichment uranium, which there's no commercial supply for it. It's being developed little by little by one company in the US. Otherwise, you have to buy it from the Russians, which we're not going to do. That fuel is essential for operating most of the new reactor designs. And there are lots of issues about, the NRC and all the rest of it. I would say the earliest we could see in early 30s, we could see a nuclear plant in the Northwest. Not soon enough to do us much good for all the issues we've got for the next few years. So I don't really think I don't know if it's really viable, but it could be, but it will be extremely expensive no matter what. That's the other thing to say about it. So I know there's a lot of interest in it. There's a lot of reasons to think it would be good. But I think my main concerns are about when can you come on board? What's the cost going to be? And what's the performance going to be? We don't know the answers to any of that right now.
Could you tell us a little bit about removing hydro projects from the Columbia River or whatever river?
Yeah, the hydro dams are not always great. They were done for good reasons, but maybe those reasons turned out to be, overcome by other issues where the dams, dams are going to have an impact no matter what. Most of the big dams in the West, I think, are going to stay in place. They provide good service. You can point to problems that they cause. Look at the Colorado River, for example, where it is possible that Glen Canyon will have to be taken out of service within the next 2 or 3 years. Unthinkable, but it could happen. That's not because we've decided to, it's because climate has changed the rules of the game there. Up here, we've retired and removed, or at least taken out the concrete so the river can still run through it. Quite a few dams, actually. The Elwha Dam up on the Olympic Peninsula, the Marmot Dam, PG's Marmot Dam out by Sandy, others have been taken out. And most recently, the Klamath dams, those are really big on the Klamath River, Pacific Power dams, both California and Oregon were involved in that. But the big debate is over the 4 lower Snake River dams on the Snake River going from Lewiston down to the Tri-Cities, that they're in Washington, Southeast Washington, if you don't know them. They're big, but they also cause a tremendous amount of damage to the migrating salmon, going up to a really large, about 5,000 square miles in Idaho, some in Eastern Washington, and a lot in Northeast Oregon. Oregon's has a big impact from this. And the dams don't really have a lot of storage behind them. They have some, but it's not like the main stem Columbia. So those dams are pretty close to run of the river, which means half their energy happens in the spring where we already have a hydro surplus. So the debate about the lower Snake dams is about whether we could replace the energy from those dams with a better mix. And our organization, Northwest Energy Coalition, sponsored a big study in 2018. You can go look it up on our website. If I can think of it, I'll try to put the link in the chat here, but you can find it. That looked at that question and concluded even then, before the dramatic drops that we've seen in all the renewable energy and especially battery storage, we could replace those dams in an affordable way. There's lots and lots more to say about it. There are other dams in the region that people are looking at potentially for removal, but I think the lower Snake dams are the really hot political item. And the consequence really and I'm not a biologist either, but having read a lot of the science on that, if those dams come out, it dramatically increases the probability that 2 out of the 4 remaining salmon and steelhead stocks in the Snake River, which are at most risk, that those 2 could survive for the long run. With the dam still in there, they're at very high risk.
Right. Okay.
And Ed asked about water energy storage. Maybe you could be a little give your question a little bit more context.
There were some plans on the edge of the Columbia that they were going to put lakes up above and pump water up and
Pump
bring
storage,
it back down.
pump
and,
storage, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there are quite a few proposals for this. The big one is called Goldendale. Now it's had several names. It's on the site up above on the Washington side, across from the Dalles.
Yeah,
It's where the
right.
Goldendale aluminum was. And that site is a brownfield site, but it's also a really important site to the Yakima tribe. So there's been a proposal now for going on 20 years to put, initially it was going to be I think 1,000 megawatts, maybe even been more than that. Maybe now it's down to 400, I think. Proposal to put a big pump storage facility there. There are a lot of reasons why that could be a good idea, but I think the site and the way that developers gone about it hasn't really worked out. The tribes and other groups are very unhappy with it. and they may go ahead with it. But the thing to say about, and there are other pump storage proposals. The other one that I think is two of them that I think have the most chance in the Northwest. The Swan Lake proposal, which is down in Klamath County, that seems to be on hold right now. Also had started very big and then has gotten way downsized. And one in Montana that I think, I'm not sure if that's moving forward or not, but I think nobody's really objecting to it. The problem is they just can't find a buyer. But that site is a good one. It's called Gordon Butte. It's in kind of west central Montana, and it could provide a lot of support for the wind there. There are about 10 other pump storage proposals I've heard of in the Northwest. I don't think any of them are moving forward. The thing about pump storage is it can be effective. There's a couple big ones in California. We have a sort of not very well operating one here in the Northwest called Banks Lake. You know, but they're really big and they're really expensive to do. And we have a lot of other options now for long duration storage.
Which means you think batteries are a better investment?
I would say no one thing is a better investment. They're all a good investment. We should look at pump storage. We should really give it serious thought. But pump storage is so specific to the location you're in and what are the impacts on water, on, you know, the water supply and all these other issues, cultural and historical impacts, you know, and so on. That and they're really expensive. You know, 1,000 megawatts of pump storage is a $2 to $3 billion project, and it takes a decade to do. PGE did 500 megawatts of batteries in under 3 years. You know, they're expensive too, and they also have, the pump storage is really, in terms of operating, is really efficient and flexible. Batteries are a lot more efficient and a lot more flexible.
Okay, thank you.
Now, there's all kinds of other things. There's compressed air storage. There's a big project for that going on in California and another one in Utah. There are schemes that raise and lower concrete blocks or have trains with heavy stuff like concrete going up and down inclines, a kind of mechanical storage, various kinds of chemical storage, flow batteries. There's a tremendous number of ideas out there about how to do storage other than just hydro or lithium ion batteries.
Well, love to see it.
Well, you know, there, just go to the internet. There's a organization called the Long Duration Storage it's LDESAC. My friend, a friend of mine runs it, actually, international group. Long Duration Energy Storage Council, I think, of LDA. Anyway, well, they have a tremendous amount of information. US DOE has put out a lot of good information about all the different kinds of storage, trade organizations. There's a whole lot going on with storage right now. Lithium ion is good, but it's not cheap and it has limitations, including the fire issues, the durability. You know, you have a degradation cycle on those that, like my laptop and my cell phone here are both about 3 years old, you know, have much less charge duration than they used to, you know, whereas other forms don't really have that. So but lithium ion batteries are kind of a global thing now. And the demand in the power sector is way less than the demand in the vehicle sector for those. So lithium ion costs are going to keep coming down, and all the other lithium, you know, LFP, all of the other ones. So we're kind of taking advantage of that. And that's, you know, I think rightly, those big battery banks have really got a kind of a central focus right now, including utilities like PGE.
So Fred, what about iron flow batteries? I mean, there's a company here in Wilsonville
Yeah,
that makes those, and the technology looks good. It just looks like the efficiency isn't quite as high, but you know, it seems like it's a much safer and scalable technology.
Yes, I know a bit about them. They just landed a really big deal, actually. Are they the ones that it's a little complicated because we have ESS and Poen, the other company, which is not, you know, the same. Both of them, I think one's in Tigard, one's in Wilsonville. Both of them had big financial troubles earlier this year. and one of them got bought, the other one, they both survived. They're both moving forward. I think this is a point of pride for us here in Portland. Hardly anybody knows they're there, but they're serving kind of different technologies in different markets. On the iron flow batteries, the other big firm that people know about is called Form Energy. You may have heard of them. I like the company a lot. Our former PUC Commissioner Mark Thompson is working for them now. They have what I would call a cheap, slow, long battery. Their iron battery is takes it can their kind of their initial model is 1 megawatt, 100 megawatt hours, which means they're very limited in the charge and discharge cycles.
Yeah.
It's not super efficient. I'm thinking the round trip efficiency is maybe 75%, which is not bad.
Yeah.
And it's really cheap, unlike lithium ion batteries, but it takes a lot of space, and it's a little hard for me to figure out what the use case is for that, because it's not really suitable for bulk power. It could be for microgrids. It could be really good. For the ESS, they have more of a 10-hour battery than a 100-hour battery. That's really useful if you can scale it up for backup, for local system backup, and also for managing, helping to do grid balancing, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Well, Fred, thank you for your time, and we look forward to working with you and with the Northwest Energy Coalition. That's I find the prospects quite exciting. We think that
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
As usual, I have a lot to say, so I hope it was somewhat helpful, and happy to come back anytime.
Well, we appreciate that too. So have a good day, and you'll be hearing from me.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Tried it. Thank
Bye,
you.
Fred.